Good morning, beautiful people. I'm Chris from the Landlord Training Institute. We help landlords manage their properties themselves without the stress of tenants and toilets or the monthly expense of a property manager. This week's video is all about property analysis. So before you buy that property, this is what you need to watch out for. Okay, so for those of you that have been following for a while, you know I'm a big fan of on-paper analysis. So that's different from a spreadsheet analysis. On a spreadsheet, it's a little bit too easy, in my opinion, to lie to yourself. So I like doing these things with pen, not pencil, on a piece of paper over and over and over again. One of the very first areas that people will lie to themselves about is a projected rent for the property they're looking at. So they may be going into a new area. They maybe are going into a new city. And what they'll do is they'll make a phone call or two or three, maybe some property management companies, maybe a few realtors, maybe the listing realtor, and they'll ask their opinion on what they can get for rent. That often leads to a bad time. That's usually not a very accurate number. I highly recommend you do that research yourself. Don't just phone a friend on this unless that friend is an expert in that style property for that specific area of that specific city. Next up, once the blood gets flowing and you get that excitement of finding a new property and touring a new property, what a lot of people will do after they've toured that property is they'll kind of fudge the numbers on what the condition of the unit is. So for the overall condition of the unit, you're looking at either a scale of 1 to 5, maybe 1 to 10. And what'll happen is people get so excited about finally finding a property that might fit their system that they'll just over-exaggerate those numbers a little bit. Get a few different sets of eyes on that property. If they're telling you it's junk, it's junk. After that, in some areas of the world, utilities are not paid by tenants. It's just not commonly done that way. Generally speaking, the landlord will cover those things. If you're in an area of the world where that's the case, and you run the numbers, assuming that tenants are going to be paying even some of the utilities, say like heat or water, whatever it might be, that might come back to bite you. So that's another area where people that are maybe a little bit newer to things start analyzing a property, and you can make it look really good on paper, especially with a spreadsheet, if you don't know that you're kind of lying to yourself with certain things. After that, we should talk about the line item that can change your analysis the most. It's the easiest one to fudge the numbers if you really wanted to, and that's taxes. So what I do is I buy an ugly property in a great area and I fix it up. I'm assuming a tax increase of about 20% when I do that. I'm actually not adding additional units. I buy them with the units in place, and then I just renovate. If you're doing something like taking a single family home and turning that into an additional unit home, so it's either something in the back, like a garage suite or a basement suite if you have basements. If you're adding an additional unit and you don't account for a significant tax increase, you are lying to yourself. For this line item, for what I do with single family homes, just basically walking in and wiping away the ugly, I budget for a minimum 20% tax increase. Next up, a lot of new investors are going to want to hire out property management. I'm not necessarily saying you shouldn't do that or you should do that, but if you make a few phone calls and you ask property management companies, what are you going to charge me for this single family home every single month? They're probably going to give you an approximate range there, a minimum charge of, say $100 a month, but also they'll tell you that there's a percentage. So they've got a fee structure that'll be a percentage of rent, and then there'll be certain fees on top of that. They're not likely going to tell you every single fee on top of that over the phone. It's incredibly common for new investors to either say, I phoned around and they told me it's going to be 7% or maybe 10%, or else they'll just say, I'm going to manage that myself. If you don't include an expense for property management in this part of your analysis, what will happen is you just signed up for a part-time job that you're not getting paid for. So if you are hiring out and you make that phone call and they tell you maybe it's 10%, that's likely going to come in much higher than their estimate. After that, we should talk about a vacancy allowance. And post-COVID, a lot of areas have very low vacancy. So we've seen a sort of shift in where people want to live and how they want to live. And so certain areas have experienced extremely low vacancy. There's a lot of pressure on rents and there's not a lot available. However, If you are a newer investor, and even if you're a more experienced investor, I highly recommend don't just go by the area vacancy. Those numbers are valuable. They're more valuable in the context of understanding what is going up and what is going down. So certain areas of a city, vacancy might be increasing or decreasing. So those numbers are valuable for that. They're not quite as valuable with respect to budgeting for vacancy. I'll give you an example. There are a lot of areas where I invest where the vacancy in those areas is actually only about 1.5%, so 1.5%. If I was to budget 1.5% and I do a 1-year term, at the end of that 1-year term, if somebody moves out and I need a week or two or maybe a little bit more to actually fix the place up a little bit, I've got to do some painting, maybe there's a couple doors that are needing replaced, things like that. If I've got a month of vacancy, that's 8.5% of my annual rent. So if I've only budgeted 1.5%, I've used 5 years, a little bit more than 5 years, of vacancy in one turnover. It's incredibly easy to go over budget on vacancy if you're using an area number and the area vacancy overall is very low. So in my spreadsheets, I put either 8.5% or more often I put 10% because those numbers are easier to calculate. Now let's talk about a controversial one, repairs and maintenance. A lot of folks the last decade or even two have been buying new properties for buy and holds. But what will happen sometimes is people will assume because the property is new that there won't be any repairs and maintenance. And so you go a certain amount of time maybe without repairs and maintenance, but at some point that has to kick in. If you haven't budgeted for that, when it does start to come up, so in year 2 or 3, maybe 4, you're going to end up being over budget. Your cash flow gets eroded away and you're going to wonder why it's happening. And it's only happening because you didn't budget repairs and maintenance. If you are holding the property for 5 years or longer, you have to have a number in there. After that, we're going to talk about my personal pet peeve area, and that is capital expenditures. Again, even if you've got a new home, it's going to need some work on the driveway every 10, 15 years. Maybe a new fence every 10, 15 years. Maybe it's brand new and there's no lawn or no fence or any landscaping done whatsoever. Those things, if they've got to be capitalized, you need to budget for. You are going to have a CapEx cost if you're holding that property for more than 5 years. It's going to happen. Next up is interest rate. And the most common way that people will lie to themselves about this is they'll fill out some paperwork, paper analysis, or they'll pop some numbers into a spreadsheet and they'll put the number they're hoping for. The problem with that is that once you've viewed the property, you've spent some time walking through it, you're picturing what you're going to do to it, how it's going to operate, how awesome this is going to be. When the bank comes up back to you with a number that is, say, a couple points higher than that, you're still going to want to do the deal. Now, if you're Canadian, you need to budget for some interest rate increases as we go throughout the year. So those are a few different areas where people very frequently lie to themselves when they're filling out their property analysis tool, whether it be a spreadsheet or a piece of paper. I'm Chris from the Landlord Training Institute. We help take the pain out of property management. I'll see you next week.